Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. We're almost there. We have about an hour and a half to go, but a very good hour and a half, I think. Some of you have said to me, it's been great, but my head hurts. And that'll be over soon. So we have one really good keynote almost here. And then we'll have a discussion, more or less open discussion, with all of us after that for about 25 minutes. And then some parting remarks, and then we can go elsewhere. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Ananya Roy to you, who holds an endowed chair in the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. It's a chair in inequality and democracy. Previously, she was at Berkeley for quite a few years, but now at UCLA. Her work, I would say, is at the intersection of urban studies, development studies, and planning. I think that would be fair to say, and also given her educational background, but certainly all the work that she has published. And she's a luminary, I think, in this field of comparative urbanism and comparative urban studies, and beyond that. I got to know some of her earlier work when I was doing my research in India, and some really influential works. One a famous book on Calcutta that she wrote, but a series of articles that focused on the notions of informality and planning and the planning challenge in India. And then, of course, there's her work in urban studies that goes well beyond India and reaches lots of other areas. Her 2010 book on poverty capital, microfinance and development, was a very important one. And I think many of you will be familiar with her article on that is called "What is Urban?" about critical urban theory from about 2 or 3 years ago. So wonderful, Ananya, to have you here. Please welcome Ananya Roy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at the Urban Studies Institute for this wonderful conference, and I thank Jan for this invitation and the staff at the Institute for all of their work in organizing this conference. As some of you might know, today is International Women's Day, and I don't know if this was intended, but of course my presentation is a feminist project. I also want to do a shout out to Jen Erb, and I hope you take a look at the flyers that they have distributed about their ongoing and upcoming work. This conference on comparative urbanism, with the rich collection of papers that we have had the opportunity to hear and learn from over these past 2 days, is a visible manifestation of what may be understood to be the post-colonial turn in urban studies. In broad brushstrokes, that turn can be characterized as a challenge to the Euro-American provincialism of what often masquerades as universal urban theory. In a world of cities, that turn has often entailed thinking from the south, or what I have called new geographies of theory. I have termed this both a reworlding of cities and a reworlding of our disciplines. Today, in my brief talk, I wish to celebrate this moment of reworlding and its vibrant expression in a conference such as this, but I also want to take the opportunity of our collective presence here in Atlanta to outline some of the challenges of urban studies and urban theory that are on my mind. I have titled my talk "The City as Post-Colony" in order to foreground these challenges. In particular, I will highlight 3. First, I'm deeply concerned that despite the post-colonial turn, the epistemological and methodological foundations of urban studies remain untouched by post-colonial thought, or by feminist thought, or critical race studies, or queer geographies. These seem to be on the margins of the dominant paradigms of urban theory and are still pleading their case for relevance. They are understood as provincializing, as localizing, rather than as reworlding. Let me be clear, our citationary structures have moved just a bit, but that does not mean that our epistemologies and methodologies have as well. Indeed, I worry that I and other, that I and other post-colonial scholars have become citationary alibis. And that's a piece I'm dying to write. The recently published article by Emily Rosenman, Jessa Loomis, and Kelly Kay on the limits of engaged pluralism make this evident. They note that often citations perform the function of recognition, thereby maintaining intact structures of power and knowledge. And let me be clear, I have no interest in engaged pluralism. I'm interested in how our theoretical commitments, whether we call this critical theory or not, take account of historical difference. In other words, socio-spatial difference forged in the crucible of the long histories of racial capitalism. In this vein, I worry that the theoretical frameworks that do explain historical difference continue to be read and recognized as specialized fields of inquiry, such as Black geographies, Latinx geographies, feminist theory, queer theory. Put bluntly, the main categories of urban studies have not necessarily been reconstructed by these radical traditions of thought. Second, I'm concerned that thinking from the South might be increasingly translated into urban and metropolitan studies in the Global South. That, by the way, is the title of a faculty position for which we are currently conducting a search at UCLA. As many of you know, my interest in thinking from the South has not been an effort to tell you some exotic story about slums in Kolkata or militias in Beirut, but rather it has been about what the Komarovs have pinpointed as the South as a relationality. This means that we have to expend considerable theoretical effort to elaborate the colonial and neo-colonial relationalities at work in our world of cities, including the very complex question of South-South exploitation and hegemonies. It also means that we have to rethink the ways in which the cities of the North Atlantic are understood and positioned in these global relationalities. This task has always been on my mind. Following Derek Gregory, who in turn is thinking with Edward Said, I see this as interrogating and shifting, in Gregory's words, the stories that the West tells itself about itself. In urban studies today, that story, the untold story, seems to be racial capitalism. In previous work, I've called this the color blindness of urban studies and planning. Feminist scholars, critical race studies scholars such as Kate Derrickson, Laura Pulido, and others have called this the unbearable whiteness of geography. Put bluntly, for me, the project of thinking from the South is pointless unless we are able to reposition the cities of the North Atlantic in global histories of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. Thus my provocation of the city as post-colony. Third, I'm interested in the political life of urban studies today. My understanding of comparative urbanism is rooted in the Black radical tradition, which not only sees these global histories of racial capitalism, but also sees interconnected imaginations and practices of liberation, from anti-colonial struggle to abolition. At the Institute on Inequality and Democracy that I have the great privilege to direct at UCLA, we produce theory and scholarship that journeys with, accompanies, to use George Lipset's phrase, radical social movements in Los Angeles and elsewhere. I used to think that the citationary structures of these movements and a university-based research center would be different. Not at all. We are in fact rooted in shared epistemological and methodological foundations, be that Fanon or Mignolo, Clyde Woods or Ruthie Gilmore. And I want to be clear, this is not a US-centric project. It is necessarily a project of comparative urbanism because it means resituating cities such as Los Angeles in a world of cities. It is the project of rethinking the city as post-colony. And what I'm most interested in is how such rethinking might allow urban studies to participate in what my dear friend and colleague at UCLA, Robin D.G. Kelly, has famously called freedom dreams. At the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, drawing inspiration from Robin, we aim to advance freedom dreams in unequal cities. Not pluralism, not inclusion, not equity, but freedom. At the conclusion of my talk today, I'll give you a glimpse of what that might mean in urban studies and what it might mean for a re-signification of American urbanism. But before we can talk about the city as post-colony, we have to talk a little bit about current debates in urban studies and that post-colonial turn. As you all know well, there is a lot of chatter in urban studies today about planetary urbanization, and therefore about what might be urban about the urban and planetary about the planet. I don't mean to trivialize this debate. There is a lot at stake in it, including the knowledge power structures that shape our discipline. I have to say that I've been rather appalled that some of this debate has been recast as a standoff between good men and hysterical women, or equally problematic between political economy and cultural studies. What I care about hasn't changed much since my urban geography lecture at AAG a few years ago and that subsequent article, What is Urban about Critical Urban Theory? In it, I argued that in contrast to conceptual frameworks that emphasize the urbanization of everything, I wish to pay attention to the constitutive outside, Chantal Mouffe's concept, of the urban, and to the always incomplete processes of becoming urban. This, for me, is what feminist scholars call non-totalizing theory. It is also what Leclau and Mouffe, among many other post-Marxist theorists, conceptualize as structural undecidability. Their beautiful phrasing, which I relied on quite a bit in my Kolkata book, is contingent articulation. And above all, for me, structural undecidability or contingent articulation means analyzing and narrating the urban from the standpoint of absence. As feminist scholars such as Linda Peake have shown, questions of the outside and of absence have become urgently important in the debate about planetary urbanization. In her essay in Society in Space, Natalie Oswin situates herself on the outside of this paradigm, along with feminist, queer, and critical race studies scholars, noting that this ontological and epistemological outside has been in existence in urban studies for a very long time. In similar fashion, postcolonial scholar Tariq Jazil interrogates the claim by Neil Brenner and Christian Schmid of a planetary urbanization without an outside. I'm especially interested in Jazil's critique because of its focus on what he calls the knowledge object of urban studies. In other words, the urban, the city. We like our tautologies, don't we? We are urbanists because we study the urban. As Jazil argues, I quote, urban studies cannot help but reify the knowledge object's constituent of its own identity. He goes further, and this is a very interesting provocation, and I've been reading and rereading it over the last few days. Tariq writes, as long as the nature of these sociospatial processes remains obscured by the hegemony of the critical gaze within urban studies, the city, the urbanization, but has trouble seeing beyond this holy trinity, we might in fact refer to these sociospatial formations and processes as subaltern geographies, insofar as their contextual nature and workings are dissimulated. Jazil asks us to be attentive to other sociospatial formations at large in multiple modernities. There is a lot in this single phrase by Jazil for us to consider. But for today and for now, I'm going to have us consider a two-part provocation and proposition that makes up for me the city as post-colony. The first part of this has to do with an argument I had laid down in my urban geography article. How might we think about the urban as a historical geography, indeed as a historical category? In contrast to arguments drawn from Lefebvre, that we live in an age of urban revolution, I suggested that we pinpoint the conjunctures at which the urban is made and remade, often in highly uneven fashion across national and global territories. That rehistoricization of the urban via post-colonial thought, via the Black radical tradition, is for me some of the unfinished work of transforming urban studies. And quite frankly, if we are to talk about a context of contexts, that much used phrase, and I see that this computer doesn't like the talk of post-colonialism. All right, there we go. If we are to talk about a context of context, racial capitalism is that context of contexts. But equally at stake are those sociospatial forms that might not be easily read as the city or the urban. And for this, I turn to what is understood to be Black geographies. In my recent writings on abolition, including in the article just published in Society and Space, The City in the Age of Trumpism, I draw on Catherine McKittrick's landmark essay, Plantation Futures, to suggest that we consider the plantation, and McKittrick's words, as a meaningful conceptual palimpsest to contemporary cityscapes that continue to harbor the lives of the most marginalized. I find McKittrick's methodology of palimpsest to be incredibly productive, much more so than those of precedents or blueprints or templates. Palimpsest, with its meanings and practices of erasure, overlay, reuse, seems just right. McKittrick argues that the plantation, because it evidences an uneven colonial racial economy, in her words, that while differently articulated across time and space, legalized Black servitude while simultaneously sanctioning Black placelessness and constraint is an important conceptual palimpsest for the contemporary city. Nick Heinen builds on this as he makes the case for an abolitionist understanding of urban political ecology, one that in his words wrestles with the racialization of the environment and seeks to effect, again in his words, the abolition of white supremacy from the metabolic processes that produce racially uneven urban environments. And of course the plantation logics, plantation regimes, plantation blocks of power figure prominently in the writings of Clyde Woods. In Development Arrested, Woods makes a vitally important point that returns us to Jazil's concern with the sociospatial forms of multiple modernities, those that might not be so easily shoved into our knowledge objects of cityness or urbanization. I quote, "By the late 1960s, social scientists had abandoned the critical investigation of rural relations in the predominantly African-American plantation counties of the South. When they are examined, there's a tendency to superimpose categories created for the study of northern manufacturing-based cities onto the social and institutional histories of rural regions. What is lost, Woods writes, in the process is not only an appreciation of the continuity of plantation-based economic systems and power relations, but also the critique of these relations. For Woods, Blue's epistemology is precisely this critique of plantation social relations and their extension. But I didn't say the city is plantation or the city is prison. I said the city as post-colony. There's been some amount of discussion in urban studies about concepts drawn from subaltern studies, be it the concept of subalternity or that of political society. There has been much less engagement with the idea of the post-colony that comes out of the work of scholars concerned with thinking and writing from Africa, notably Achille Mbembe. Today, I want to briefly focus on Mbembe's notion of the post-colony, particularly his landmark book on the post-colony, but also a series of essays by him on this theme. Mbembe describes the post-colony as a distinctive regime of violence, or what he sometimes describes as the banality of power. In his words, the post-colony is a critical and dramatic site in which are played out the wider problems of subjection and its corollary, indiscipline. Mbembe's emphasis on violence leads us, of course, to state-instituted violence, for example, the forms of racial banishment that have been at the heart of my most recent research. But he also asks us to consider colonial and post-colonial authority as commandement, which for him is about power and coercion, as well as the convivial rapport between those who give orders and those who are supposed to take orders. In other words, Mbembe sees the post-colony as an ordering of the world. In his words, the forging of relations between those who command and their subjects. For him, at the heart of this relationship is the simulacrum. The simulacrum for him is baroque, grotesque, and intimate. I'm drawn to Mbembe's concept of the post-colony as a conceptual palimpsest for the city for two reasons. First, the city as post-colony brings us into direct confrontation with the epistemological and methodological challenges of the post-colonial turn in urban studies, notably the politics of representation. As Mbembe notes in his own reflections on his book, the post-colony evokes the staging of the difference of the non-West from the West. Writing as he is about the post-colony, that is something called Africa, he has to contend with what he describes as a web of absolute otherness. This is a form of writing that endows Africa with an identity it never possessed in the first place, while never being able to open up a space for the continent to manifest its self-presence. We know this problem in urban studies. But the second reason I'm drawn to Mbembe's idea of the post-colony is the simulacrum that lies at the heart of commandement. As I've noted before, the post-colony is a regime of violence, one where the power to kill or civilize is exerted. And as Mbembe emphasizes, the power to kill and the power to civilize are interchangeable. But I want to focus on the simulacrum. And what I'm most interested in the moment is the ways in which the simulacrum is property as possession. There are many analytical and political implications of thinking about the city as post-colony. For today, the one I want to gesture at is how we might trace what Alyosha Goldstein calls a genealogy of possession. And I'm going to give you two very quick examples of this. In a recent essay titled The Epistemology of Property, co-authored with Mukul Kumar, which appears in the book Subaltern Geographies, co-edited by Jazeel and Legg, I argue that the formations of property, and specifically proprietary and tenancy rights as we know them in India today, have their roots in a British colonial apparatus, the Permanent Settlement of 1793. That settlement sought to create a semi-feudal system of landowners by bending backwards European categories of property. As Timothy Mitchell has shown, modern notions of cadastral property emerge in such context of colonial experimentation, creating peculiar notions of private ownership, often yoked to revenue streams for colonial corporations and regimes. It is thus that physiocratic thought, a powerful critique of feudalism in Europe, produced neo-feudal property relations in colonial Bengal. Or take, for example, the post-colony to which post-colonialism has not arrived, the United States of America, one where we cannot even begin to think of land reforms. In what I consider to be a foundational essay, Money, Mortgages, and the Conquest of America, Kesu Park, legal and critical race studies scholar, shows how land became liquid in colonial America. The instrument that we know as foreclosure, that we so often narrate as neoliberal, well, that instrument, Park shows, was created by settler colonists by a bending backwards of English property law. While English property law did not treat land as chattel, colonists engaged in predatory lending practices to American Indians seeking to create debt and steal land, created what Park has called a brand new American commodity. By the 1670s, colonial laws instituted foreclosure in America, enabling and legitimizing the widespread expropriation of land from indigenous people and turning land into real estate and the speculative commodity that we know it today. This is the history of dispossession in the United States. This is the historical geography of property. This is the city as post-colony. In making the case for urbanizing settler colonial studies, which I also see as the case for decolonizing urban studies, Libby Porter and Oren Yefthekel argue that the urban has been rendered as a place that is not indigenous, as profoundly spatial and temporally disconnected from indigenous histories and geographies, despite the obvious fact in settler colonial societies that most cities and settlements sit on unceded territories. So in this last bit of my talk, I know I'm almost out of time, I'm going to give you a few examples of where this thinking might lead us. If we are to follow Kesu Park in the historical geography of property, in that genealogy of possession that is the city as post-colony, we would find that so many of the towns of Massachusetts were grabbed and stolen by William Pinchon and his son, John Pinchon, through the use of foreclosure against indigenous people. This is accumulation. If there's an urbanization of everything, that was it. Now, my epistemological and ethical orientation to urban studies is through post-colonial feminism and now through the Black radical tradition. So I do want to make the point that in her reflections on Mbembe's concept of the post-colony, Judith Butler argues that the power in the post-colony that Mbembe is interested in is first and foremost masculinist power. I don't have time for this today, but what I'm also very interested in pursuing as I think about the city as post-colony is property, personhood, and power related to the gendered body. And one terrific example of this kind of work is, of course, Sylvia Federici's influential book, Caliban and the Witch, which points to the ways in which we need to understand primitive accumulation in relation to the disciplining of the gendered body, or here in the case of the United States, Saidiya Hartman's work on the gendered body as the scene of slavery. So in wrapping up this talk, let me make a methodological point. There's a tendency in urban studies, especially in planetary urbanization, to read the constitutive outside as rural. The plantation or the post-colony as the conceptual palimpsest of the city is not the rural. The agrarian question, which I've emphasized, is not the rural. These are forms of historical difference, and these forms of historical difference are spatialized, racialized, and gendered. So it is from that place of historical difference that I arrive at the city or the urban. Keenly aware of Jazil's critique of the knowledge objects that we reify in urban studies, I nevertheless arrive at the city and at the urban. And so let me, in conclusion, share with you two snippets of writing that foreground such arrival, writings that are decisive for my argument to think about the city as post-colony. I won't interpret the writings for you. I'll leave that up to you. The first, in homage to the city or unceded territory that is Atlanta, comes from chapter 7 of Du Bois's 1903 magisterial and poetic book, The Souls of Black Folk. That chapter, titled Of the Black Belt, and that is a conceptual palimpsest, starts with a train from the north thundering through the crimson soil of Georgia, stretching away bare and monotonous right and left. Du Bois writes of Atlanta as bordered by the land of the Cherokees, the spot of Sam Hose's lynching, and the remnants of the vast plantations. He writes of the black tenant and the shadow hand of the master's grandnephew that collects the rack rent remorselessly. Only black tenants, he observes, can stand such a system, and they only because they must. The second snippet of writing comes from Richard Wright's extraordinary photo documentary, 12 Million Black Voices, published in 1941. In so many of his writings, Wright emphasizes the din of the city, the machine city, a din that enters his consciousness and stays with him, frightens him. In 12 Million Black Voices, he pinpoints the urban. It's the kitchenette. And he writes, the kitchenette is our prison, our death sentence without a trial, the new form of mob violence that assaults not only the lone individual, but all of us in its ceaseless attacks. The kitchenette with its filth and foul air, with its one toilet for 30 or more tenants, kills our black babies so fast that in many cities, twice as many of them die as white babies. Wright is a key interlocutor of the black radical tradition, of black rebelliousness, as Cedric Robinson puts it, which is not only rebelliousness to slavery, but rebelliousness to what Robinson calls racialist, Eurocentric, ruling class history. Here then is one of my favorite images from 12 Million Black Voices, appropriate for International Women's Day, titled Made, Washington, D.C. So let me close then with a provocation about the political life of urban studies once we take seriously the proposition of the city as post-colony. One of the photographs in Wright's 12 Million Black Voices is this, a photograph titled, ironically or perhaps not ironically, Inheritors of Slavery. It can be seen as a genealogy of possession, as a radical rehistoricization of inheritance. I also see it as the grounds of what Du Bois has called abolition democracy. Central to such visions of freedom are ideas of redistribution and reparation, not recognition, reparation. As in the case of the black radical tradition, the call for reparations has always been global, connecting struggles in one post-colony with those in another, connecting, as did oddly more, the struggles for reparations with the struggles over social reproduction. Most recently, the case for reparations has been made by Ta-Nehisi Coates, as well as by economists like Sandy Darity, and most prominently by the Movement for Black Lives. I'm interested in an urban studies that takes up the theoretical and analytical challenge of abolition, democracy, and reparations. In other parts of the world, including that part of the world we call the Global South, this is called land reforms. The United States, the post-colony to which post-colonialism has not arrived, cannot think about land reforms. To think from the South is to make possible what only seems to be a freedom dream. It is to insist on liberation. It is to recast property and personhood outside of the shackles of bondage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ananya, for a very powerful and provocative intervention. I can't claim that we picked a date because we knew it was going to coincide with the Women's Day. I like to think it was auspicious timing, though. I now wish we had had a paper, and we actually thought about it ahead of time, on Atlanta as a post-colonial city. And I have the feeling that it will be written very soon, though. We have about 5-10 minutes for some discussion before we go into our final panel, discussion panel, and we'd like to open the floor.
Sounds good.
Yeah?
Do you want me to take the questions?
Yeah, you can take the question.
Yes.
There's a microphone on board. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Nanan Xu, a PhD student from University of British Columbia. I have identified in this conference there's a highlight word, the global East. How do you position the post-colonial or the feminist agenda in the global East research? Such as I come from China, I'm doing research about China, and how could those terms generalize from the Anglo-American context could be applied or transferred to like Chinese studies? Thank you.
So let me answer that in two ways. One, I think that we can think about the post-colonial feminist as categories, as socially embodied categories, and we therefore have to think about what those categories mean in the context of different parts of the world with their own distinctive histories. But we can also think about them as epistemologies, so I use them primarily as traditions of thought that are not necessarily rooted in particular territories of the world, though they have some relationship clearly to places and the histories of that place. So that is yet another way. And so one would then have to think about, and I know this term has been used quite a bit as a key structure and provocation of this conference, what the global East might mean then, right, as George Lynn said at the opening plenary, as a methodology. And in particular, what it might mean to me, more interestingly, as an epistemology, and what then are those traditions of thought, and how they would most likely either reconfigure categories like post-colonial and feminist, or even perhaps not use them and use other categories.
So thank you once again for a very powerful talk. I've been privileged to hear another version, but I thought taking your challenge in invocation seriously, since most of us spend our time at universities, can you think through what are the responsibilities of people who work at universities? Now, they're not quite plantations, but they well, this is the point. So what is the responsibilities of people who work at these palimpsests of current forms of capital formation? So, yeah, just continue in that sort of gospel.
So, I didn't mean that as a joke. I actually, yeah, I know. At the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, our founding premise has been decolonizing the university not as a slogan, but really thinking very much about the university as an institution of racial capitalism. So if I were giving this talk at UCLA, I'd be talking about how quite literally I would be standing on stolen land, the lands of the Tongva people, right? So the university is a post-colony. And the reason why I'm particularly drawn to Ursula Mbembe's work is because I see it rooted in a moment in South Africa that is wrestling with these questions of the transformation of the university. Having said that, I don't think it's enough for us to acknowledge the university as an institution of racial capitalism. We've got to think about the forms of knowledge production, the forms of research, and the practices that allow us to begin to dismantle that system. And this is why that third concern I raised was about the political life of urban studies. I worry about the distance, and it feels to me like a distance, between many of the big theory debates we're having in urban studies at the moment, that take out the pages of our journals, including the one I edit, and the struggles on the ground, the frontline struggles, which are also deeply theoretical, but they theorize the world in quite different terms, right? This talk, and everything I said of it, will be totally legible to the movements I work with in LA. They would get exactly what this argument is about, and they would know all the citationary structures and what's at stake. But what's at stake for them might be somewhat different than what's at stake for us. Yes.
Thank you for a fantastic keynote. I'd like to ask you, where do you see... Oh, sorry. Oh. So thank you again. I wanted to ask where you see the presences and limitations of capitalism within racial capitalism as a situated geohistoric concept. If this is the context of context, what work does the capitalism within racial capitalism do in your argument?
So, I think that one way of thinking about this is that the term racial in racial capitalism is redundant. The capitalism is, as we know it, a racial project. I think the opening chapters of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, for me, is one of the best histories of capitalist accumulation that shows precisely the ways in which the struggle over slavery in the United States, for example, was of course a struggle over racialized bodies and the control of those bodies, but was also very much a struggle over the plantation economy and about the global cotton trade. Right? So Black Marxism, as Cedric Robinson called it, is very much a way of thinking about the political economy of capitalism by an understanding of race, but it is also very much showing how, in fact, race as a social construct was produced in the crucible of capitalist accumulation. And I can give you many other examples of it. I would argue that Spivak's work in post-colonial studies is precisely that as well. That what Spivak's theory of subalternity is not read that way. I don't know how often Spivak is actually read rather than simply cited. But Spivak's arguments are precisely about an understanding of the relationship between capital accumulation, colonial subjection, and gender difference.
Let's do one more question and then we transition into the
I want to ask how you think about the state in relation to this. And just to use the example of Atlanta, since we're here to think about how, this is how I might think about the role of the state in this framework that you're proposing. So Du Bois uses Reconstruction as the basis for thinking about a racialized state and changing the racialized state and the racialized relations of property. Decades later, you have one of the first key black mayors in the United States in Atlanta. That first era of black mayors being another period of attempts at institutionalizing reforms on the basis of rethinking racial capitalism. What would you see as the broader agenda for thinking about the urban state within this framework?
So I'm smiling because I'm so glad you asked that question. That has been the basis of the recent research I've been doing, primarily in Los Angeles, but it started on the south side of Chicago, concerned with racial banishment, as a way of understanding the contemporary moment of evictions and urban displacement and dispossession in the US. And I use the term banishment because I'm interested not in what is often seen to be market-driven displacement, but in state-instituted violence. Not just state-driven displacement, but violence, right? And that, of course, takes us back to these long histories of the state. But it's precisely from that place that I find myself returning again and again to Du Bois's understanding of the state. So I had the privilege of attending this wonderful session chaired by Alan Mabin, and Professor Burgess had a brilliant presentation to conclude that. And she talks about how she did not want us to think about reparations, the reparative gesture, and how that always creates its own waiting lists. I have to say that I am very interested in redistribution and reparations from the perspective of Black Reconstruction. I see it as a re-enchantment of democracy, not as liberal democracy, but in Du Bois's sense of Black Reconstruction, and Atlanta is a good place to talk about it, as you know. But Du Bois's notion of the state is very specific. The state of which he dreams, and this was the talk I was just giving at UIUC a few days ago, and Ken was a discussant on that talk. The state of which he dreams is created through what he describes as the uprising of the Black man. But I would argue that in many parts of the global south, the post-colonies to which perhaps post-colonialism arrived, we've seen those uprisings. I don't know what that uprising is here. This is why I talk about the US as the post-colony to which post-colonialism has not arrived. So I'm very interested in a re-enchantment of democracy and in what it means to think about the state from a perspective of abolitionism. But that in turn means thinking about what the state connoted to abolitionists and to our anti-colonial struggle, which is not the state of Black political power necessarily, of Black capitalism, right, or of liberal democracy, or even of cosmopolitan Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ananya. So we thought it would be a good idea to have our final session of the day of the conference as a panel, as a discussion panel, but have you all involved in that. And so I want to ask the keynote speakers, and well, Cindy Fan very graciously agreed to step in for George Lynn, who had to get on an airplane already. So Cindy's going to join Kevin and Ananya over there where usually the Supreme Court justices hang out. And yeah.
I always want to teach from a podium like this.
Yeah, do try to make yourselves visible, please. So we have about 25 minutes for this, and of course it's not very long. But allow me to start off with a question to the keynote speakers, to the panelists, and give them a chance to respond to that, and then, you know, let's see what kind of questions you may have, or comments you may have, observations to share. All right. So the question I want to ask of you, and you know, Ananya, you just gave your wonderful keynote, and I think your answer is in there. So in any case, first let me direct the question then to Cindy and to Kevin. You know, what do you see as the main hindrance or obstacle or challenge to advancing this project of comparative urbanism? Where do you think the problem lies? So this debate has been slowly emerged about 20 years ago, has been going on for quite a while. And sometimes it appears to have descended into sort of a standoff. What are your thoughts on that? What's next? What's next after an event like this?
I try? First of all, I feel very powerful sitting here. Where's Michael Cohen? Well, thank you, Jan, for these questions and for the opportunity to pretend that I'm George Lin. I wanted to start off by just talking about maybe the Global East a little bit, because I think that has to do with the two challenges I like to mention. So there's quite a bit of conversation about the Global East in this conference, but I really think that it seems to me that this is in response to the binary, namely Global North and Global South. I'm not quite sure that we have a coherent understanding or concept of the Global East yet, and I don't know if Martin Muller is here. Yes, there you go, Martin. And there's quite a bit of discussion of China in this conference, and I don't quite know actually that in your thinking whether China is in the Global East. So I think everybody has a different understanding of the Global East, but that's fine because it's a good response and intervention, I think, to the binary. So the two challenges in response to your question, Jan, that I have, that I want to share with you also have to do with the binary. And in fact, in my questions to you, Kevin, yesterday, I had started to think about those things. And the first binary is the urban and the rural, and I think Ananya has kind of talked about it a little bit. And I just want to clarify that when I say the urban and the rural, I'm not talking about the geography. I'm actually talking more about identities. I'm actually talking more about inequalities. And I'm also talking about the people. So in my own work on migration, internal migration in China, I look at the rural migrants in urban China, but most of the slides in my presentation are about the homes that these rural people or these migrants are from. Because I think these homes that they're from are part and parcel of their identities and part and parcel of the urbanization they are part of, that they are really the engine of urbanization in China. So I think you can't, and I've attended, I think, a session either today or yesterday where the presenter talked about housing vacancy in urban China, and you can't quite analyze housing vacancy in urban China without also looking at the housing vacancy in rural China where these migrants are from. So I really think that I would be very happy to see that the so-called urbanists, and I don't quite understand what that term means, but last night we had a dinner, it's like, are you an urbanist? Are you an urbanist? Are you an urbanist? So I would be so pleased that the urbanists would embrace the rural fully. The second challenge I wanted to highlight is another binary, one that separates so-called theory, or maybe broad brush theory, and again, I think Ananya has alluded to that already, and deep knowledge about the context. And I think the deep knowledge is not just about knowledge, but about first-person experience and about language. So far in this conference, I haven't heard anybody talking about language, but I think language is such a key skill and tool to investigate anything that is global. But in any case, I think this is a construct, this is a binary between theory and contextual knowledge. Let me share with you a personal experience. So I was born in Hong Kong, I was raised in Hong Kong, and I went to Ohio State University for my PhD more than 30 years ago. And when I arrived in Columbus, Ohio, the first thing that struck me was the streets are empty. Especially the streets are dark at night. How can this be a city? Because I was used to Hong Kong being the city, high rise, lots of people, crowded. So I have deep knowledge about Hong Kong, but but so I am able to maybe see and perceive and the loopholes of any theory that's imported and parachuted into a particular context. But at the same time, I think my deep knowledge of a place could also be a minus, because it may be that I fail to therefore acknowledge the variations, the variety of cities in other parts of the world. So how can we address these binaries? My solution is that we can do both. We don't have to be like what Ananya was saying, that I think, quoting her, I think she was talking about good men versus hysterical women. So that is a binary. So perhaps we can be both, and I think there's a tendency for academics to do this. I think there's a tendency for academics to take a side, and I rather see that we do both, or we work together as a team. Thank you.
Okay. There's a thing here, you press, the light comes on. Okay. I guess I am, what would I say? I get, my first point, having spent the last 2 days listening to a whole host of people saying very interesting things, is I don't think there is a project. I think what we've seen over the last couple of days are a whole set of different projects being pursued in very interesting, fruitful and vibrant kinds of ways. I counted at least 4 kind of modalities of comparison at work over the last couple of days. Singular comparisons, intra-urban, inter-urban, trans-urban comparisons. We've also had implicit and explicit comparisons. And we've had single-authored and multiple-authored comparisons. So, and from my own perspective, I don't think that's an issue. And I'd be very nervous about anyone trying to say about what the future might be for comparative urbanism. I guess over the course of a couple of days, and then when Jan asked us to say a few words or reflect a little bit, I again went back to the title of the conference, Comparative Urbanism, Global Perspectives. And again, I think listening to people speaking over the last couple of days, clearly the notion of a global perspective has meant different things to different people. I think there's been an awful lot of people talking about a more diverse set of cities, literally cities, a little bit less of the kind of epistemological issues that Ananya raised in terms of what it means to think about the global from wherever you are in the world. So a little bit less, there's been more addition, but a little bit less of the questioning of the foundations of contemporary urban studies. But I also think, and Ananya made reference to this at the beginning of her talk, about the dial, and we talked about it last night as well, about how slow the dial might move. I am pretty certain that the future of urban studies is not me. And actually, one of the things that I did enjoy, not just over the last couple of days, but probably over the last 10 years, of hearing younger, earlier career researchers who looked more different. They don't look all like me as an old white man from Manchester in England, and have a different and a more diverse set of theoretical frameworks and methodologies at play. Now, that it might be frustrating for some of us that the movement is slower than we might like, and that there are structures in place that are slowing down where we might want to get to. But I guess at the end of a 2-day conference, when I'm feeling a bit tired, I'm also feeling positive. So I guess for me, the challenge is to continue to keep the space open for the diversity within urban studies. That might also mean some uncomfortable conversations about naming what urban studies is. And so Ananya started talking about the problem with black geographies, about why we need black before black geographies. Maybe we're thinking about white heteronormative urban studies as the unspoken thing that we've not talked about. And we need to name it first before we think about what its future might be. Maybe that's the biggest challenge.
both. Well, diversity is a good thing, right? So let's open it up. Any comments, questions, observations that anybody would like to make after these 2 days?
Thank you. Maybe this builds on what Kevin just ended with. It's the power of naming, you know, and I'm glad that Ananya is putting racial capitalism so that we don't separate the two. And I want to remind of Bell Hooks' patriarchal racial capitalism. So we, by putting all three together, we are constantly reminded that they are inseparable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for these inputs and remarks. I just wanted to pick up on the two aspects that Cindy mentioned, which was the East and the language question. And I think one of the charming aspects of a concept such as the East is actually its polysemous nature, its fuzzy nature, that can reference a European East, a Middle East, a Far East, and an East Asia. But I think also that we need to pay attention not to territorialize the East, but to see it as an epistemological category. And I think that is the important challenge. And it's a challenge that's difficult to escape because terms such as East and South tend to territorialize. And so the question I think we should ask about the East is not necessarily where is the East, or not even what is the East, but what can the East do for us in an emancipatory way? What kind of project can one articulate around the East? And that's what I see as one of the main missions of this conference. And I'd be happy if that was a major outcome of this conference, actually, in terms of introducing a third term and highlighting in between spaces uncertainties in that context. And I think language question comes up if one thinks the East territorially simply because of the multiple different languages. And the language question complicates comparative urbanism massively, and it was brought up in at least one session on translation that very powerfully drove that point home. And I think what was interesting to observe in this conference is we had yesterday 2 sessions that explicitly carried urban theory in the title. And we had 10 papers, and of 9 of those papers, the authors were at Anglophone institutions. And so the interesting thing is that urban theory seems to be a prerogative of Anglophone institutions. And I feel acutely aware of that, being myself at a French language institution, despite the fact that participation at this conference is actually quite international, more than Anglophone. Certainly the urban theory contributions came from Anglophone institutions in a majority. And so the question is, how do we open up that space for urban theorizing, perhaps for multiple languages, or at least for multiple Englishes that accommodate a broader scope of contributions from different institutions?
Yeah, thanks for all these important contributions that were made over the last couple of days, in particular this final set of observations. I come away from this with much new insight. One of the things I was thinking about in that debate that Ananya took as one of the opening sets for your argument is that I've been thinking about it for months now, as you can imagine, those of you who've been following those debates. One of the things I noticed what was going on is that in terms of binaries, I think I like to think more in terms of spirals that got intertwined, and there was friction in these spirals. And let me say what I mean by that. I think we need to be aware of the historical nature of our discoveries. When I came to the United States, the first time, when I came for the first time to the United States, I studied in Champaign, Illinois, and we were doing Black Studies, which was called then Black. I don't know if that program still exists, Black Studies? No? Well, we read Du Bois, and right? So we read Du Bois in a particular environment. I read all of Du Bois. I have the books at home. In the early 1980s, they were contextualized in a different environment than today. There was no Black Lives Matter, but there were other contexts. There was the complete devastation of Chicago. There were people coming from Chicago to live in LA, in Champaign. Then a few years later, when I lived in LA, I noticed that people were discovering Henri Lefebvre. And that was really strange to me because we had already read Lefebvre in Europe, in French and in German, which was translated, but Lefebvre wasn't translated into English. So people made discoveries. And over the years, I see Du Bois or Lefebvre or anybody in that lineage, including Marx, is now rediscovered, much to the, because of David Harvey promoting Marx. Is it always a rediscovery generation by generation and creating a new conversation around those literatures. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that each generation thinks they reinvent the conversations about that literature in a different context of struggle. And I think one of the things that came was less the binary between the hysterical women and the immobile political economists who were white men. I think there were different trajectories in spirals of struggle that were getting intertwined and led to a number of misunderstandings, which I think is very important to realize in order to not go for an easy pluralist attempt, as you said, and I agree with you on this, but it is important to recognize each other's struggle. And I think that one attempt was made in that context by Christian Schmidt in his Society and Space piece, was to actually express the depth of the historical layered readings of those different types of contradictions. So that is my appeal, if we want to continue this conversation, to be respectful of each other's histories of struggle and our own discoveries in other political contexts than the ones in 2019. That's the only appeal I would like to make. Because if we wanted to compare each other, we also need to not compare just geography, but also the histories of the history of ideas in which we couch our efforts.
Yeah, may I build on that? Yeah. Roger, thank you so much for reminding us of that history of ideas. I think that's crucial. So, two reflections related to your reflections. One is that what if instead of discoveries we were to think about disruption? So, I did that piece, What is Urban about critical urban theory? It could have been, well, what is critical about critical urban theory? Which is a question, of course, that Nancy Fraser's asked about critical theory, Neil Brenner's asked it about critical theory. And for me, partly this current moment in urban studies, I think, requires us to give some thought to what the role of critique is and what critique is and how we model the practice of critique. And we've talked a lot about this and what it might mean to do this collectively while having tremendous disagreement, right? We should have tremendous disagreement. But the method of critique is important, and I think we need to think about the work that does. And for me, increasingly, the turn to, as a student, to the Black radical tradition is as an auto-critique of the work I have done in post-colonial feminism. So I'm interested in the shift that the Black radical tradition insists on from the figure of the critical theorist to the figure of what Harney and Moten call the subversive intellectual. So I'm very interested then in what that history of ideas is that disrupts, right? So why we return to certain old texts in ways that might be disruptive. But the second point I want to make relates to the very important note on which Kevin closed his plenary yesterday about citationary practices. Edward Said reminded us from the very start of his writings on postcolonialism of the importance of citationary structures. And I think one of the challenges in urban studies and the reasons why I argued that there are still all of these other traditions of thought that are pleading their case for relevance is an asymmetry in citationary practices, right? Who reads what and who cites what? In what ways? And I think that has to change. But also, and I use this term citationary alibis, and this goes to the point Kevin was making about addition rather than dislodging. So quite frankly, you can't cite Kevin Ward and think that that's a proxy for the epistemology and methodology of showing how comparison is political, right? You can't cite me and think that's a proxy for post-colonial feminist methodologies and epistemologies. You've got to demonstrate that. And inevitably, as critique becomes canon, there's a way in which a whole set of critical voices then also become citationary alibis. And I think it's really up to us to constantly disrupt that, not just for the sake of disruption, but precisely for the sake of producing epistemologies and methodologies more attuned to the concerns of the time.
We have time for one more comment. Or Richard, is there a microphone? That was going to be the last one. Yeah, I think good.
Well, I'm very thankful for this discussion of methodology and the idea of palimpsest. And I'm currently struggling with the use of the term racial capitalism, or maybe the list that Bell Hooks gave us sort of again and again, and how to appropriately think through, I guess, if the city is the post-colony, what is the, and thank you for recognizing the unceded territory where we're at, but what is the reservation, or the reserve if we're in Canada? So if we're thinking about racial capitalism in North America, is there not a slippage that happens there where we kind of fold the experience of sovereignty struggles on indigenous lands into the same? Or do we just constantly double or constantly list as we think through those kind of commonalities but also differences?
I'm assuming that's partly a question for me.
Yes.
Right. So in the work we've been trying to do on race and capitalism at UCLA, which is in collaboration with the National Endeavor on Race and Capitalism, led by Michael Dawson and Megan Ming Francis, there are different pieces of this. There is a comparative racialization piece to this, right? But there's also very much a recognition that these histories of settler colonialism and the historical moments of settler colonialism, which are often overlaid, particularly in a city like Los Angeles, have to be seen as different and yet related. So my interest in the Black radical tradition, or in a particular version of post-colonial studies which comes out of subaltern studies, is because of the ability to see those global relationalities, right? And absolutely, if Alyosha Goldstein was in the room, then he would say the city as reservation, right? It need not be the city as post-colony. And I think my reliance on Kesu Park's work is precisely to show the ways in which how some of the questions, urgent questions, animating Black geographies today and animating the movement for Black lives today, such as predatory lending, and particularly predatory financialization, in fact take us back to the history of the dispossession of American Indians and, in fact, I think Native peoples throughout the North American swath of territory.
If I could just perhaps add a bit of a different perspective to this conversation, and that is, I think what we're talking about here is not just merely an academic exercise. I think there's so much policy and practical implications that are already unfolding on college campuses. At UCLA, we created a new position a few years ago on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that's the vice chancellor position. And equity, diversity, inclusion is certainly something that is being replicated across the country in academic institutions. It's not only something that professors and faculty write about, but that they have become really the goals that underlie everything that colleges do. So the reason I'm saying this is I think that, especially as someone who has come from a faculty track, but now in administration, I think there's so much potential in the marrying what academics do in terms of racialization and inequalities, and what practitioners, and I think that there's at least one practitioner in the audience, what they care about. And I think when Ananya talks about the grassroots, what's in the front line, those are the activists, those are also the practitioners, and I think that we can learn so much from them. So I just want to throw it out there that there's a policy and practical perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy. If you don't mind, I'm going to get in front of you here just for what will really be just a few closing remarks for this conference. So, and I want to transition some of these comments into just a few quick reflections on the Urban Studies Institute that I intended to make when we started off, but there wasn't any time, so I left it for now. So the Urban Studies Institute was created in 2017, and I like to think of it that we burst onto the scene. This coming fall we'll have 8 faculty appointed in the Institute, so they're core faculty in the Urban Studies Institute, 8 of them with a couple of hires now on the way, 4 postdocs, 25 affiliate faculty across the university, say in the law school, for example, in public health, in the College of Arts and Sciences, in the business school, and so on. Our first crop of PhD students starting this coming fall, and we are in the first year of our first year of the master's program. So things have developed really, really quickly. You know, there's a reason that Georgia State wanted this Urban Studies Institute, and it really reflects on some of the issues that we have talked about. Georgia State University graduates more African Americans than any university in the country, in the United States. And many of these students are first-generation students, and not just of African Americans, but of all our students are first-generation students. You have noticed, the university is smack in the middle of Atlanta, in the downtown area, and only about 4 or 5 years ago in the strategic plan of the university was it stated explicitly that this is an urban university, and the implication was it has a role to play in this city and in this state and maybe in the southeast and maybe even beyond that. I want to give you a brief anecdote that is quite interesting and that connects to some of the discussions here. So the president of our university, Mark Becker, and Provost Palm, whom you met at the beginning of the conference, have been in meetings in South Africa, in discussions with universities in South Africa to discuss admissions, equity, racial equity, also in terms of admissions and graduations. And when I first heard about it, it was a really interesting thing to hear about, in the sense that apparently Georgia State University in Atlanta deals with some of the same issues as some of the universities in South Africa. And so this whole notion of Atlanta as a post-colonial city sort of comes into focus with that. I want to thank very expressly somebody you haven't really seen. You've seen her probably, but she hasn't really been center stage, and that's Laura Avilo in the back. Please. And Laura has been with the Institute for about 2.5 years. We set it up. She was there from the very start and has been a tremendous force in making it happen, so thanks a lot. The organizing committee, which is Jean-Paul, Deirdre, I saw you before. John Marshall, are you still here? No, and Fei Li. So they've been really instrumental in getting this conference off the ground. And some of our graduate students who are still here, I think, wave your hand if you're still here. Yeah, there are a few still here, and they've been helping in making this happen as well. And this institute, would have been impossible to realize. Imagine, any institution of higher education, if you want to create something new, good luck in fighting the bureaucracies and all the resistant forces in bringing on something new. And so affiliate faculty for us who are not appointed as core faculty in the institute, but who are in other parts of the university, such as Deirdre Oakley in sociology and Catherine Hankins in geography, have been tremendously helpful and also in making this happen. Now, for me, this has been just a really wonderful experience. And like you, I couldn't attend everything. So I've missed about 2/3, which is kind of depressing, actually, when I think about it like that. But just today, the papers that I could attend, Catherine's paper and David Lay's paper, and Roger's paper, and Patasarati's paper, really Nancy Grimm's paper, I really, really enjoyed and gave me lots of food for thought. I think you all voted with your feet to come to this meeting and to underscore the point that this is an important topic, and I hope you come away with it feeling enriched. There are no easy answers going forward. Maybe that's a good thing, because we're into this business because we like to be intellectually challenged. And we have choices, and I think for many PhD students and people who maybe just got their PhD, it's a challenging environment. What to study, where to study, your geographical focus. Should it be comparative? And what kind of way could it be comparative? And in some ways, I certainly hope that you feel inspired about what you learned. So thank you all very much for coming here and making this possible. Now, we're going to wrap it up. A number of us intend to go for happy hour to a place called Krog Street Market, K-R-O-G Street Market. And we think that's a good place to go to. You probably have to get an Uber. It's about a 35-40-minute walk to get there. But you may want to take an Uber or take the streetcar that gets you halfway there. And then you could walk for 20 minutes. Just look it up, Krog Street Market, if you want to come. It's a good place to go because it has this sort of a plaza. It's one of these refurbished old industrial sites, and it looks pretty cool. And we can have drinks there. There are different food places in there. It's almost like a little food court, and a couple of restaurants, and you can find something of your taste, but hopefully then we can still meet up